Thank you very much, Chair. I'm, of course, fully aware of the fact that being among the last to speak, I will return on a number of issues that have been abundantly dealt with in these 2 days' discussion. Well, as it happened, it's actually a privilege because I heard a number of things with which I'm not sure I'm in total agreement, so it's a good opportunity to revisit some of those. You might say, I mean, having heard for 2 days of presentations and discussions on democracy, what's the point? I mean, has everything not already been said? Very immodestly, I would argue that the answer to this question is no, that there are a number of things that still need to be said, and above all, that still need to be noticed. I'm not so much going to talk in normative terms and explain how democracy should be organized. I'm just trying to suggest that a number of things have happened already. As undemocratic as the EU may be, a number of things have happened which make this well-established issue of its lack of democracy a more, let's say, urgent issue than it ever was. And as you will see, I think the movement that there has been in the last decade has been a movement in two opposite directions. On the one hand, I think the problem has become, let's say, if anything, more serious and threatening for the Union. On the other, I think the Union too has made some steps on the road towards more democracy that need to be better understood because their potential is still, let's say, not sufficiently noticed. First point, why do I argue that the problem is more serious than it was when the first democratic deficit was first coined on the occasion of the first parliamentary elections at European level 40 years ago? Simply said, and here I can refer to a number of things that, that have been said today in particular, because very significant transfers of powers have happened over the last decade in the wake of the economic and financial crisis. Very significant transfers of power for two reasons. A, because they deal with the hardcore of sovereignty. Fiscal policy is the hardcore of sovereignty because it conditions the ability of state to do virtually anything. Banking policy too belongs in that category in an economy like the European economy, which is mostly financed through banks. If you centralize the control of banks at the European level, you remove very substantial chunks of powers from the member states. Secondly, the way it has been done is interesting, but the outcome is equally important. The outcome has not merely been Europeanization of decisions in those areas. It's even more interesting than that. It's been a transfer of crucial powers to those supranational bodies that are least directly accountable, according to what we heard, to the general public, namely the European Commission and the European Central Bank. The European Commission has gained a lot of control power by virtues of the six-pack, the two-pack, the fiscal compact, as everyone knows in this room, and the ECB as a result of banking union, the incomplete process of Europeanization of banking regulation. I'll return in a minute to those transfers of powers because they ask an important question. But let me simply note that it's important to realize that they took place at a time where virtually nobody was advocating major transfers of powers. public opinion was not supportive of that. If you refer to Eurobarometers of the period, that's very clear. And equally clear is the fact that none of the European leaders were pushing in favor of that shift. If you look at the big declarations made by the two statespersons that were supposed to be in the cockpit, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, they both said in very different ways, well, this is not the time for more transfers of powers to the European level. This is the time where nation states must take the helm because they are the structures that enjoy the largest legitimacy in a union of nation states. And yet, a couple of years afterwards, they agreed to the major changes that I have just mentioned. Why is that? I repeat, is a question that needs more attention, because as much as I can agree, for instance, with what we heard this afternoon over constitutionalization, in this very case, the over-constitutionalization was not due to the, let's say, appetite of power of a supranational court. It was decided by the sovereign representatives of the member states. Interesting to notice, because it means that it's not merely the interest-driven explanation that is the best one in this case. Why did they do it in a nutshell? Why did they say it may not be our preferred solution, but we have to accept it? My simple answer to that simple question is because of mistrust among the leaders of Europe. They did not trust one another. Typically, if you want, the Germans were not particularly impressed by the way, say, Greece had been implementing the commitments it had undertaken in order to receive the first bailout. And the Greeks and many Southern European countries were not particularly eager to be governed by the Germans. So they all agreed on what was in the mind of their respective leaders, clearly a second-best solution, delegating more powers to supranational bodies because of this mistrust, which arguably is one of the cornerstones of the whole of the European integration process. If we had time, I would indulge in that kind of historical reconstruction, but we don't have time, so I will not do it. What is interesting is that one of the mottos at that time was depoliticize decision over those issues, particularly on the German side. Depoliticize because we don't trust political implementation in the hands of, by the way, not merely in the hands of Greece, in the hands of Italians or even of French, for that matter. And because we don't trust them, we want an automatic, not only implementation, but sanction mechanism. That was the issue at the time of the fiscal compact in particular. Depoliticization is simply said. How was it done? Well, firstly, by a constitutionalization process that did not merely affect the EU level, but also the national level. The fiscal compact mandated the creation of fiscal policy councils at the national level, as was discussed this morning. And this is where, as I said, delegation to supranational bodies came into the picture. It was very beautifully summarized by Herman Van Rompuy when he said, well, at the European level, there aren't so many ways of depoliticizing decision-making. If you leave it in the hands of the member states, it won't do. So the only solution is to communitarize decision and control. And I insist on that reconstruction of what has happened, because, of course, it is in direct contrast with one of the dominant readings of that period, which is the so-called new intergovernmentalism. I don't dispute that the big decisions were taken by the member states in the European Council. Indeed, that's one interesting part of the puzzle. But I think what that vision underestimates is the very important agenda-setting role of supranational bodies in the decision phase, and the fact that the output of those decisions was, as I said in starting, a significant transfer of powers to the supranational institutions of the Union, and thereby, by corollary, an aggravation of the democratic deficit. Secondly, I would argue that, with all due respect to our debates, the issue is now much more important than a normative issue in the minds of a number of analysts of the EU. If you read the newspapers, you see that it's a public problem. That is indeed the focus of much attention in, well, virtually all European countries, because the policies that have been followed at the European level have played a great role in the emergence of strongly anti-European populist movements in a great number of countries. I know that last year there was a sense of relief after the election of Emmanuel Macron and the failure of Geert Wilders to secure a majority in the Netherlands. But I think we already saw it was a short-lived moment in the life of the Union. The wave of Eurosceptic populism has certainly not faded, and therefore the problem is extremely acute for the time being. It's made even more difficult by one element which I think needs to be emphasized, which is the fact that it would be fine if all across Europe we had, the emergence of a clear popular movement in one direction. But the situation is actually much more complex. We have a very polarized union where you see greater polarization along a number of axes between the North and the South in terms of economic policy, between the East and the West on a number of other issues. And in that respect, I want to emphasize that it's interesting to note that in the scheme of decision by consensus that we have at the European level, the two most disputed decisions actually taken by the European legislature were decisions that pitted the East versus the West on posted workers and on the vexed issues of the relocation of refugees. Two issues in which a very rare thing happened in the EU. You had a qualified majority in the Council of Ministers, but instead of having, as is the case in 75 of votes that are made at the European level, only the opposition of one single country, you had the opposition of a very substantial minority of Central and Eastern European countries. And last, but by no means least, it's fine to say that we see populism all around Europe, but it's not the same. There is a South European populism which is rather leaning on the left. There is North European populism which is rather leaning on the right, and for which the beautiful term of welfare chauvinism has been coined. And, of course, France is blessed because it has both, being in the center, left and right-wing populist movement. I mention these elements because they suggest that talking of rules is one thing, but then, of course, if we talk about majority rule at the European level, it's good to know that we are confronted with an extremely polarized, not only opinion, but political spectrum, which makes both, let's say, majority rule difficult and arguably dangerous. It follows from what I said almost mechanically that let's say discussions rather about European policy making are bound to become more politicized. It's already the case at the national level. It may not be obvious for everyone because one tends to consider that discussions about European issues are discussions about the future of Europe. What kind of Europe do we want? And it's true that rulers tend to avoid that kind of discussions because indeed they know that they are a good way to divide their parties, they are a good way to lose votes, and there are very few votes in the present times to be gained by having a very clear stance on what we expect from Europe. It's fair to say that Emmanuel Macron, in that respect, was an exception because he campaigned on a, let's say, openly declared adhesion to the idea of more European integration, a rare feature in political debates. But it would be a mistake to derive from this the conclusion that there is no debate about Europe at the domestic level. Look at recent electoral campaigns. Maybe you did not hear that many politicians taking clear positions on their vision of the future of Europe. But what were the issues they focused on? What were the issues that were most important in the minds of voters according to all the opinion polls? Issues such as employment, such as the future of the welfare system, education and the like, which are, of course, critically affected by the policies, fiscal policy in particular, that are imposed by the European level. And this is known to people, and this is known to politicians. So you have a kind of, let's say, discrete, creeping politicization in some cases, where the focus is not so much on the future of Europe, but on issues that are very directly related to Europe. And of course, it's a golden opportunity for populist movements to surf on this content by expressing their opposition to Europe. That's the situation at the national level, and that's why I think it can be said that the problem of the democratic deficit is perhaps more acute now than it's ever been in the past. But at the same time, it's important to stress that at the European level this time, things have been moving too. In a remarkable fashion, in the sense that it was not the product of a grand debate or a clear choice in the favor of one model. No, it was a power play that imposed a big innovation in European politics. That was the system of Spitzenkandidaten in 2014, at the time of the European elections. Now, I want to emphasize that this change was in a way the result of a fight at the European level between different camps. On the one hand, there was the camp of those who argued that it was the corollary of decisions that had been made 20 years ago, 20 years before, at the time of the Maastricht Treaty. And of course, it was strongly pushed by a political actor who knew that he could only gain by advocating this solution, namely Martin Schulz, because he knew that basically his only chance of becoming Commission President was through winning the support of a majority in the European Parliament. It's equally interesting to note that a significant number of important political leaders at the time this happened were openly against the change in question. It was the case for the President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy. It was the case for the Chancellor of the most important member state in the Union, namely Angela Merkel. Very openly, they said this should remain in the hands of the national government, because indeed we need a relation of trust between the European Commission and the heads of state and government gathered in the European Council. And yet, as we know, this is not what has happened. Why not? Certainly not because of the intensity of the campaign, because those of you, and I suspect that there are quite a few in this room who have had the curiosity to try to follow the debates, which was not easy in the first place, will have noticed that it was not very lively. There was not a very clear discussion about clearly identified alternatives. I mean, you could tell that one of the leading candidates was taller than the other, and the other had more hair. But beyond that, the differences between Martin Schulz and JeanClaude Juncker were, I think, very hard to discern if you did not know a bit of their background. Interestingly, if you look at voters' perception, it did not make much of a difference either. Here you have the result of a survey that was carried out at the request of my colleague Nicolas Sauger and myself, that indeed foresaw, among other things, questions to voters about how important that issue of the Spitzenkandidaten was in their choice at the time of putting their ballot in the box. And basically, in all countries, those who thought that this was important were a minority. A small minority in some cases, that's the green column. Look at Greece, 22%, I think, thought that this was important, versus 55% who said, I couldn't care less. And it's interesting because Greece, of course, at the time had a very Europeanized campaign, because the big issue was, should we accept more austerity mandated by Brussels? Now, what is interesting is that equally we had on that occasion the demonstration that the hope that Spitzenkandidaten, let's say the Simon Hicks theory for the insiders who know about that debate, the idea that putting clear alternatives before the voters will lead them to vote more massively, was belied, at least on that occasion. You see that here you have the turnout in 2009, in 2014, the difference over there. You see that there was, as we just heard from President Tallinna, a slight decline in turnout. Well, interestingly, it happened in countries where there was above average support for the idea of Spitzenkandidaten, and therefore the possibility of having a say over people and programs. Equally interesting is the fact that if you go beyond the surface and look at which are the categories in which the idea received the warmest support, you find that basically they are social categories that are traditionally supportive of European integration. People who vote for center-left and center-right parties, that have faith in the European institutions, and on the whole support the integration process. So it spoke to those who were already convinced members of the church, so to say, but not at all to those who were against the process. And I repeat, the most telling example in that respect is that of Greece, because it would have been a wonderful opportunity, and Tsipras was a candidate to the presidency of the European Commission at that time. Now, of course, I do not mean to suggest that this has transformed the European Union in a parliamentary system. There would be a long way to go to get there, assuming we would want to get there. But something has happened still since, as we know, JeanClaude Juncker was eventually chosen. And he was chosen, I repeat, not only against the negative vote of David Cameron and Viktor Orban, but against the declared wish of a number of important politicians. Again, the key question is, why? What made them accept that? The dominant thesis in EU politics is that this is a victory of the European Parliament, because there was a convergence within the European Parliament around the idea. That's certainly an important part of the explanation, but it's only one part of the explanation. The reading of the situation by one of the key actors of the time, Herman Van Rompuy, is slightly different. He said, no, it's not a victory of the European Parliament against the European Council. It's a victory of political parties, which is slightly different. And he told me the story. Days after the vote, I attended the conferral of the Charlemagne Prize in Aachen, and I was struck by the fact that all the, of course, on that occasion, he met quite a number of people from the CDU, and they all came to him and said, well, that's great, we won. We won because our candidate has won. And from the standpoint of, let's say, party faithfuls, it would have been difficult to understand that their candidate, having the support of a relative majority of members of the European Parliament, he would not be then supported by the Parliament itself, the whole of the Parliament, and subsequently by the European Council. So here is something that suggests that there is indeed some sort of change that has taken place that was perhaps not sufficiently noticed. What's also interesting is that it did not stop there. It's true that the Commission itself was composed according to the treaty rules, that is to say, with commissioners essentially chosen by the governments of the member states. And therefore we have the Commission, the Juncker Commission is, as in the case of its predecessors, not only multinational but also multi-partisan. But if you look at what the Commission says about what it does, first thing, you see that indeed, the priorities of the Juncker Commission are those of the Juncker candidate, first thing. You see also that Juncker has transformed the organization of the Commission to create a more strongly hierarchical system with vice presidents that are supposed to be coordinating work within the Commission around what? Around the themes that are the main themes of candidate Juncker's platform. So what this, again, suggests is that there is the emergence of something that looks like a chain of command that could ultimately, I'm very cautious here, connect policy choices made by the Commission to the concerns expressed by the voters at the time of the European elections. It's, of course, a transformation that is far from being complete. But it has happened to a degree which I think is not sufficiently noticed. Let me focus on one example that has been much discussed today, which is economic policy. if Europe is following the economic policy imposed by the Germans, as you hear in South European countries, why is the Juncker Commission so unpopular in Germany, and particularly with a number of German politicians? The answer is that those people would agree with Juncker on one diagnosis. This commission is unlike the previous ones. It's, quote, a more political commission, unquote. Now, if they agree on the diagnosis, it doesn't follow that they see the situation likewise. It's fair to say that the economic policy followed by the Juncker Commission is not the same as the one followed by, and particularly when it comes to fiscal policy, it is not the same as the economic and fiscal policies pursued by the Barroso Commission. The Commission adopted an interpretation of its own of the new rules put forward by the six-pack, the two-pack, and the fiscal compact, indeed taking advantage of the discretionary powers that it has gained as a result of that change. Yes, we have more rules as to economic and fiscal policies now than 10 years ago. But it has not been sufficiently noticed that precisely because you have more rules, he or she who implements them has greater leeway in deciding how they are to be implemented. And indeed, the Commission notoriously has exercised its discretionary powers in order to, let's say, soften, alleviate the pressure on Southern European countries. Yesterday on the plane, I was reading a long interview in the French newspaper Le Monde of the president of the French Court of Auditors. And one of the central themes in that interview was structural reforms need to be intensified. It's not been, yes, an effort has been made, it's remained too superficial, it's not deep enough, it's not strong enough a movement. And then the journalist says, but that's a strange statement for the president of a French institution to make. The European Commission says that this is all right, this is in line with the reformed Stability and Growth Pact. And President Migaud's answers is in one sentence: the Commission is a political body, we are a judicial body. So we stick to the rules, we're not trying to achieve any kind of compromise. Compromise between what? Between different kinds of actors, perhaps, between different kinds of concerns in a segmented polity, perhaps, as well. But I think I found the fact that a leading figure from the French establishment made that kind of comment is indeed telling of what has happened at the European level. Now, it is a situation that can be seen in, of course, completely different ways according to where you stand. If you are part of, let's say, if you were part of the German government that militated in favor of the fiscal compact, you're bound to say, well, this is not what we agreed. And this is a problem. We are not pleased with the political commission and its interpretation of the treaty rules. If you are in the Commission, and indeed this is the dominant discourse of JeanClaude Juncker, you will say, look, firstly, I have a political mandate. I was elected president of the Commission on the basis of the vote in 2014, and the main result of the election, with all due respect to the big political families, that they both led lost ground in the European Parliament to the benefit of populist movements of various obedience. So simply said, you might say the voters sent a signal to the European executive heard it and acted on what it thought was, on the basis of what it thought was the mandate it had received from the voters. Which of course leaves us with a big problem because, as we know, a large number of the powers enjoyed by the European Commission, and arguably even those it enjoys under the fiscal compact, are powers that have been devoted to it by countries, indeed inspired by ordoliberalism, who wanted to have a faithful agent implement the agreements that were passed between the member countries and written down in law. So the model is clearly the kind of trusteeship model that was so nicely described years ago by Gian Domenico Maione, and not that of a government that would owe its legitimacy to election and be in a position to determine freely the course of action it wants to pursue in order to respond to the concerns of voters. The big issue of the years to come will be to determine not so much which of these two souls is the commanding one, because I think they're bound to remain, both of them. They've been with us for a great many years now. And I don't suggest that one has to prevail over the other. But the question is what kind of balance we achieve between these two. I argue that the 2014 vote has moved the lines fairly significantly. It remains to be seen, of course, since it is not written down in stone that the European Council must by all means follow what say, emerges from the consultations with the European Parliament. It remains to see what will be done this time. You certainly have heard that for all its pro-European enthusiasm, President Macron is very lukewarm on that very issue. That's very easy to explain. His party is nowhere on the European political landscape. So there's no way that he can have an influence over the Spitzenkandidaten system. So unsurprisingly, he is now advocating the same kind of principles that Angela Merkel defended unsuccessfully in 2014. It remains to be seen what the political parties will do. It remains to be seen what the European Parliament will do. Parliament has said 2 days ago that it wanted to repeat the scenario of the last time, equally unsurprisingly. We'll see what emerges from the power play. I suspect that once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it won't be easy to reintroduce it inside, as is known. And therefore, it will be difficult to explain to already disenfranchised citizens and potential voters that no one wants to revert to the former situations in which indeed their vote was deprived of any influence whatsoever. It also remains to be seen whether this will have an impact over voters, which it didn't have last time. But last time the rules of the game were uncertain. This time we will have we see already people moving in order to position themselves in the 2019 game. It may be also more apparent to potential voters. It may be precisely because a number of things have happened in the meantime, an opportunity for more people to express themselves about what they think the course to be followed by the EU institutions in the next legislature ought to be. All this remains to be seen. But I think what we at least should be aware of is that much change has already happened. And that, I think, is not sufficiently acknowledged in discussions about the democratic deficit in Europe. I'll stop here because I realize that this is something that lends very well to discussion. Thank you for your attention.